Hey everybody, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we're going to be going through the discography of the English rock band Lush, another very pivotal and important group to come out of England in the late 80s, and they left key contributions to the musical worlds of dream pop, shoegaze, and noise pop. And as is the case with so many groups to come out of this period, they only released a handful of albums throughout their time as a band, but I think it is undeniable that they have left us music and albums that will forever be timeless and will always be regarded as essential listening within the dream pop and shoegaze genres. So what I'm going to do is go through their 3 studio albums as well as their compilation album Gala, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree and how you would rank these 4 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, that's it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut compilation album from 1990 titled Gala, and I will give this one an S. Incredible album. And this one is a combination of 3 different works, which consist of their first mini album, Scar, as well as their first 2 EPs, Mad Love and Sweetness and Light. And each of these releases have differences in style and production, which makes for a very enjoyable listen, and you can really see how their sound evolved throughout this 1-year period. And the track listing actually goes in reverse order of when they were written, starting out with the 3 tracks from Sweetness and Light, and then going into the 4 songs from Mad Love, and then concluding with 6 tracks from the mini album Scar, as well as an ABBA cover, and then an extended version of a song from Scar. And because their sound started from more of a noise pop and post-punk sort of foundation, and then evolved into more ambient, dream pop sorts of directions, we hear that stylistic shift throughout these tracks. With the album opening up with the 3 tracks from Sweetness and Light, we get much more of an atmospheric, dream pop sort of vibe that brings the album in absolutely beautifully. My personal favorites of these would be Sweetness and Light and Breeze. And then when we go into the 4 Mad Love tracks, we definitely hear more of those post-punk and noise pop elements, particularly on the tracks Leave Me Cold and Downer. And if I had to choose a favorite of the 3 different releases that this album is comprised of, this would probably be my favorite of the 3. I really enjoy all of these tracks, but my personal favorites would be Deluxe and Thought Forms, both very cool songs that capture all of the elements that I love about the Lush sound. And both of these songs utilize some interesting time signatures as well, having sections that are in 9/8, which is actually a time signature that Lush utilizes more than a lot of other bands, and we're going to see that pop up on a couple of more songs throughout this video. And then after that, we have the 6 songs from Scar, which take on a mixture of shoegaze, post-punk, noise pop, and dream pop. A really nice solid batch of tracks, with my personal favorites being Scarlet and Second Sight. Scarlet in particular would definitely be my favorite song from this album, and a track that would easily make my top 5 favorite Lush song list. In my opinion, it is the perfect dream pop song with such an ethereal vibe to it. Then the album concludes with an ABBA cover of Hey Hey Helen, which I personally could kind of do without. It would definitely be my least favorite track on here. And then it wraps up with an extended version of Scarlet, which I love. So I really love the combination of these 3 different releases. They are all distinct and unique sounding in their own regards, and do a really great job of taking the listener through their evolution of sound over that 1-year period. And other than the ABBA cover, I wouldn't say there are any tracks on here that I dislike, and I think each individual release has some real high points, with my favorite tracks being Scarlet, Deluxe, Thought Forms, Sweetness and Light, Breeze, and Second Sight. So an amazing compilation album. This one gets an S. Alright, moving on, we have their debut studio album from 1992 titled Spooky, and this one will also get an S. I absolutely love this record. There are so many great things going on all throughout this. Stylistically, this one is mostly in the dream pop and shoegaze sort of realm, with a couple of detours here and there on select tracks. We've got amazing production from Robin Guthrie of the Cocteau Twins, and I think his sensibilities really worked perfectly with a group like Lush, because I do think they share some similar sounds to Cocteau Twins, and I think Robin knew exactly what to do with them. The album is 12 tracks long, with Emma and Mickey splitting up the songwriting pretty evenly. It opens up with Stray, which functions as a very nice introduction to the album with these strummed guitar chords and cymbals against these beautiful vocal harmonies that eventually crescendo into a nice washy reverb-laden distortion. A great opening track, and then that is followed by Nothing Natural, which is a more energetic dream pop track that to me has Robin Guthrie all over it. The production really captures those Cocteau Twins vibes. And then it goes into my favorite song from this album titled Tiny Smiles, an absolutely incredible song that is so interesting from a musical perspective. The chord progression is all over the place with all sorts of colorful harmonic movements, and the vocal melody just glides over it so beautifully. Easily one of my favorite Lush songs, and a song that I find pretty underrated within the Lush community. I'm always surprised that not more people praise this song because I really do think that it's incredible. Then they bring the tempo down a bit with Covert, which is another favorite of mine on here. Such beautiful vocal melodies and chord movements. And again, another Lush song in 9/8 time, which is very cool, and they make it feel very natural. And then the album goes into a darker and more mysterious mood with Ocean, which is a great follow-up track and a nice pickup in energy from Covert. Then that is followed by my second favorite song on here titled For Love, just a perfect dream pop song in my opinion. Really groovy, great guitar sounds, amazing production, and tasteful and catchy vocal melodies. And then it veers off a bit and goes into more of that noise pop direction with Super Blast, which is an awesome hard-hitting song and adds a nice little contrast in style as we enter into the second half of the album. Then it goes into another very catchy dream pop track titled Untogether. I love the arpeggiated guitar parts on this one, and the chorus vocal melody I find particularly catchy. Now for me, once we get to this point of the album, I do think that the next two tracks are probably the weakest point of the record. I wouldn't say they're bad songs, but I do think that Fantasy and Take are probably the least standout tracks from this album, at least in my opinion. Obviously, you're free to disagree with that, but I do love the way the album concludes with Laura and Monochrome. Laura has such a cool vibe, a really hard-hitting bass line with a really cool groove in 6/4 time, with those really washy guitars, and it just creates the perfect ambience and a really nice high energy song to set up and contrast the final song very nicely, which is Monochrome. And that is more of a slower tempo dream pop song that's very pretty and concludes the album very beautifully. So all in all, I think the overwhelming majority of this album is incredible. Like I said, it does have those two tracks that I don't find particularly exciting, but the remainder of the album I think is so strong and has so many exceptional and standout tracks that it definitely does not take away from the record very much, and it wouldn't feel right putting this in anywhere but S tier. And it contains a good handful of my favorite Lush songs with tracks like Tiny Smiles, For Love, Covert, and Laura. And I think for a debut studio album, they could not have put out a better release. So an amazing record. This one gets an S. Okay, next we have their second studio album from 1994 titled Split, and I will also give this one an S. Another incredible album, and this one would actually go down as my favorite Lush record. For me personally, I think this is their most consistent album from front to back, with a really great variety of all of the styles that they have to offer, and it also contains the largest amount of my favorite Lush songs. Stylistically, this one continues in a similar realm to what they did on Spooky, and it contains 12 tracks, opening up with the very beautiful Light from a Dead Star, which has a really great build to it, and opens up the record on a really dark and moody vibe that I love so much. And for me, I think the first 4 tracks of this album are absolute perfection. I think it's the strongest succession of songs on any of their records, and I do love the entire album, but I really think that these opening 4 songs in particular are really standout tracks, with all 3 of my favorite songs from this album being back-to-back, with Kiss Chase, Blackout, and Hypocrite, all just amazing songs, and I particularly love the layered vocal parts at the end of Kiss Chase, which creates such a magical mood, and the vocal layering and the harmony between Mickey and Emma is just so beautiful and is just a key ingredient of that Lush sound that I love so much. And then the album continues with Love Life, which, believe it or not, is the one song on this album that I've never been able to get into. I just find that song kind of boring, especially in comparison to everything else that's on here, and no matter how many times times I listen to it, it really just never does anything for me. However, I absolutely love the track that follows it up, titled Desire Lines. Such a beautiful ballad that really takes its time, and I think it is placed perfectly in the midpoint of the album after the more energetic previous 4 tracks. Then we enter the second half of the album with The Invisible Man, which is another track that I really love, with these dark and haunting vibes with very bizarre and unorthodox chord movements. Another song that I think is a great example of Lush's very adventurous sense of harmony in their chord progressions. Then we go into Undertow, which has a really cool drum and bass groove with awesome and wide-ranging vocal melodies on top of it. And that is followed by Never Never, which takes us into a more laid-back dream pop territory with really great vocal layering and guitar parts. And again, another very effectively placed track on the more mellow side. And in general, I really think the track listing throughout this is very effectively placed, and it really keeps the listener engaged all throughout it. After that, we go into a very pretty dream pop track titled Lit Up, which brightens things up a bit with a major key, and again has really beautiful vocal melodies and harmonies. And then the record concludes with 2 more songs, Starlust and When I Die. Starlust being a little more energetic with more of those shoegaze guitar sounds, and it creates such a euphoric mood. And then When I Die is more stripped down with minimal drums and consists of mostly guitar, bass, vocal layers, and a string section, which creates such a beautiful layer of sound that wraps up the album on a very nice and mellow mood. And I had mentioned that in the first half of this album, my 3 favorite tracks are Kiss Chase, Blackout, and Hypocrite. And for the second half of the album, my favorites would be Lit Up and The Invisible Man. And like I said, I just really love everything that they did on here in terms of the mixing of the dream pop, shoegaze, and the noise pop, and the really carefully chosen track listing, which keeps me as a listener very engaged from front to back, never knowing which direction it's going to go in. And when we're talking favorite Lush songs, this album would have the largest amount of those for me as well. I love every single song on here with the exception of Love Life, but again, that does not take away from this album very much at all, because everything else on here I think is absolutely incredible, and this one goes down as my favorite Lush album, so this one gets an easy S. Okay, and lastly, we have their third and final studio album from 1996 titled Love Life, and I'm going to give this a B. I have some conflicting thoughts about this one because I definitely wouldn't say that it's a bad album because it does have a lot of really amazing moments, but if I am scoring it in comparison to all of their other records, this would definitely be my least favorite from their discography, and stylistically, this one does go into a much different direction from all of their other works. This one takes on more of a Britpop sort of vibe with little hints of dream pop here and there, but very much a new Lush sound that doesn't sound really similar to the previous records that they had put out. And it's very common for a lot of these bands that had come out in the late 80s and early 90s to refine their sound if they continued making albums into the mid 90s, because it seemed like the demand and appreciation for shoegaze had wore off a bit when you got into the midpoint of the 90s. And because of that, a lot of these bands would go into a different stylistic direction. And in the context of that, I do think that this is one of the better stylistic shifts that has been made by a band from their era. The album is 12 tracks long, and when I listen through this, my general feelings of this record are that it's got a handful of songs that I think are amazing, combined with a couple that I think are good but nothing special, and then there are a few that I find kind of boring, and that is ultimately why I put it in B tier. When it comes to my favorite tracks from this record, I do think that all 3 of the singles that they chose from this are the strongest points, which are the songs Lady Killers, 500 Shake Baby Shake, and Single Girl. I think it was very smart for them to choose these 3 songs as the singles because I do think they are by far the best songs from this album. Now, aside from the singles, a couple of other songs that I think are really solid would be Runaway, the closing track Olympia, and The Child Catcher, which is in my opinion probably the song that has the closest resemblance to earlier Lush, especially with that intro. From a production standpoint, it is one of the few songs on here that does bring me back to early Lush, which I really enjoy. And the album has a couple of songs that I think are good, but I wouldn't say they are anything exceptional or stand out in the grand scheme of the Lush discography, with tracks like Heavenly Bodies, I've Been Here Before, Papa San, and Last Night. There are 2 songs on this record that I really struggle with one of them being Chow, and it really pains me to say that because I love Jarvis Cocker, but I've just never found this song particularly interesting. No matter how many times I listen to it, it just just never grows on me. And I'm also not crazy about the song that follows that, titled Tra La La. I would consider those two successions of songs to be the weakest point of the album. And in general, I feel like the first and second half of the record have a couple of really standout tracks, mixed with a couple of songs that are okay, and then a few here and there that I'm not crazy about. And like I said, in comparison to the other Lush albums, I don't think any of these songs would make my top 10 favorite Lush song list, with the possible exception of 500. But at the same time, like I had mentioned, given a lot of the stylistic shifts that similar bands had made in the mid-90s, I would definitely say this is one of the better ones, and I think that if I was listening to this album as its own piece of work, rather than viewing it through the lens of a Lush album, I would say that it's generally a good album, and I think their style transferred over to that Britpop realm very nicely. So I wouldn't say it's a bad album by any stretch, but compared to all of their other works, this would be my least favorite Lush album. So I will give this one a B. All right, we did it. We went through their 3 studio albums and their first compilation album, and these are the scores I came up with. And before we wrap up, I should briefly explain how this group broke up. So they had been on tour after the release of Love Life and started to experience burnout, and Emma Anderson considered leaving the group, but unfortunately shortly after, their drummer Chris Ackland would tragically commit suicide, and this would result in Lush taking a break and then eventually breaking up as a group. They would actually reunite decades later and put out one final EP in 2016, and up to this point, that would be everything that we've gotten from them thus far, but no one knows what the future holds for this group because there have been a lot of bands from this period that have made comebacks in the late 2010s and the 2020s with this newfound appreciation of shoegaze and dream pop. But regardless if we ever hear anything else from this group, they've clearly cemented themselves as a very important female-fronted group to come out of the creative explosion that was happening in music in the late 80s and early 90s, and these albums have aged like fine wine and will forever be timeless. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you are interested, please feel free to check out some of my other tier lists, which will be linked in the comments and the description. I've done a lot of other dream pop and shoegaze bands up to this point, so I am sure there are other ones that you would be interested in, so be sure to check that out. And like I said, please let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree and how you would rank these 4 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, that's it for today. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.